The UN is obviously the world's preeminent international institution, and over the years it has attained global reach and ambitions. Part of this is due to the ever-expanding scope of international law, discussed earlier. Part, in turn, is also due to the shifting role that crises and emergencies, and humanitarian crises in particular, play in our consciousness of the globe today. As you might recall from our opening lecture, some would argue that we are more knowledgeable and aware of the globe than were past generations, that we live in a global village of sorts. If this is true, then the UN certainly has been part of that shift, and has helped make it real to us. In this lecture, I'm going to outline some of the more important points about the UN's structure and purpose before getting into peacekeeping and international intervention, which will also lead us into subsequent lectures as well. The UN, of course, grew out of the League of Nations, which largely failed at promoting collective security, due at least in part due to the US decision not to join the organization. Since its establishment in 1945, the UN has provided states throughout the world with a voice, albeit sometimes a limited one, in shaping global law. Within the UN, there are 6 key organs. The UNSC, the UN Security Council, is the one everyone knows about, with its 5 permanent members and its 10 rotating members. Specifically, the Big Five that hold the veto on the Security Council: China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US, and 10 rotating members, who get a term of 2 years each. There have been many debates over reforming the structure of the Security Council. Inevitably, the Big Five don't want to give up their veto, and there are lots of regional reasons why different countries don't want their interests represented by their neighbors. Think of China and Japan, or India and Pakistan, sharing a seat on the Security Council, and you'll quickly see the difficulties. The General Assembly has wide but limited powers, but ECOSOC has an ever-growing set of powers, including authority throughout the WTO or the World Trade Organization. Typically, at the UN, the smaller the group, the more real power it has. The International Court of Justice, meanwhile, is designed to deal with international law disputes between UN member states, but not between individual citizens or between citizens and their governments. The most famous example of this came in 1986, when the ICJ ruled that the US had violated Nicaragua's sovereignty by backing the Contras against the ruling Sandinista regime. In the 1980s, the US used Nicaragua as a kind of laboratory for the Cold War, funding the Contras in order to overthrow what we perceived to be a fairly left-wing government in Nicaragua. This was brought to the International Criminal Court, with Nicaragua alleging, among other things, that the US was violating Nicaraguan sovereignty by getting involved in internal political disputes. There were also a series of other charges that related to, for example, putting mines in harbors around Nicaragua, and so on. Well, in 1986, the ICJ ruled that the United States of America was in breach of its obligations under customary international law not to intervene in the affairs of another state. The US largely ignored the ruling. Nevertheless, the fact that there is a forum for states to go to, the fact that there is a place to go to be heard, matters and has largely helped increase the legitimacy of the UN as the norm creator and as the norm provider within international legal disputes. With regards to the UN Charter and to understanding how all of this is organized, there are some key issues I want you to be familiar with. First, Chapter 1 makes it very clear that the organization is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all UN members. In other words, there is a clear distinction between what is supposed to be within the domestic jurisdiction of a state and what is of concern to the UN. Chapter 6 focuses on dispute resolution without the use of force. Chapter 7 is where the use of force gets legitimized. Article 42 authorizes the Security Council to take and authorize military actions by air, sea, or land in order to maintain and restore international peace or security. However, Article 51 makes it clear that nothing in the Charter impairs the right of individual or collective self-defense. In other words, if you're a state and you're attacked, even if the Security Council won't step forward to take action, you still have the right to defend yourself. However, if you're asking for permission to start a war, let's say, or to intervene in a conflict zone, the UN is supposed to be there, and the UN Security Council in particular is supposed to be there in order to authorize those sets of actions. This is a key distinction. The UN Security Council, as many of you probably know, does not have any troops of its own. It does not have a standing army. All it really has is its legitimacy. Outside of the right of self-defense under Article 51, anytime force has to be authorized, the UN's classic position, articulated very clearly here by Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, is that there is no substitute for the unique legitimacy provided by the United Nations. Even when other regional organizations, such as NATO, take up the challenge, as they did in Kosovo in 1999, this is not quite the same thing, and as a result is not always seen as quite as legitimate an intervention as when the UN Security Council chooses to act. Well, during the Cold War, two major developments took place that really shaped and structured the nature of the UN's role. The first of these is the focus on state integrity. In Africa, as elsewhere in the world, the UN is going to be very focused on maintaining the sanctity of borders and on maintaining the integrity of the territorial integrity of states above all else. In other words, it's going to be a very statist organization, and it's largely going to focus on avoiding wars between member countries. The classic example here comes from the principle of uti possidetis juris, or as you possess it. This is a legal principle that the UN refers to frequently in the 50s and 60s in order to keep member states from opening negotiations over their borders or launching wars over the shape of their borders. Essentially, it's Latin, it means as you possess it. And the principle guiding the creation of new states after colonization was supposed to be simple. Once independence is declared, once the borders are settled, that's the way they are. Of course, in reality, what this has meant is that states and governments wind up with internal political problems, for example, in Nigeria or in Sudan, between populations that have a hard time getting along. Since these are internal problems, classically the UN has had a hard time getting involved in them. We were talking earlier about the legitimacy of the UN. Of course, for a long time, getting Chapter 7 authorization to intervene in a conflict zone was pretty much the hardest of things. With the two Cold War superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, sitting on the Council, it was pretty hard to get to an agreement. So, peacekeeping evolved, for all intents and purposes, as a way around the problems of Chapter 7 authorization. Colloquially, peacekeeping is referred to as Chapter 6.5. It's the chapter that doesn't exist in the UN Charter. And indeed, the word peacekeeping is nowhere mentioned in the UN Charter. But starting in 1956, during the conflict over the Suez Canal in Egypt, teams of peacekeepers are assembled by UN member states in order to go into conflict zones and keep the belligerents apart. Classically, peacekeeping is not designed to solve problems, it's designed to create some space on the ground so that the politicians can solve problems and the diplomats can solve problems. It involves sending fairly lightly armed troops into conflict zones with the reasonable assurance that they themselves are not going to be targets. It requires the consent of parties. Obviously, peacekeepers don't fight their way into conflict zones. And it's been used successfully, as this map shows you over here, in quite a few different areas in the world. It works in Egypt, it works in Cyprus, to a certain extent it works in Lebanon in 1978, and indeed it's worked in a big number of areas around the world. Down the 50s, 60s, 70s, 1980s, this is going to be our model for keeping peace, and this is going to be our model for humanitarian intervention. And then the 1990s are going to roll around and things are going to start to change. In Somalia in 1993, the UNSC is going to authorize humanitarian intervention into that country as a way of stemming what was basically becoming a humanitarian crisis. What is going to happen is that U.S. Marines are going to get involved in trying to settle a civil war. 18 of them will be ambushed and killed, one of whose bodies will be dragged around the streets of Mogadishu. This is going to be seen as a political disaster. The Clinton administration is going to pull the UN force out of Somalia, and there's going to be much less of an appetite for peacekeeping conceived of in this sort of way. Likewise, in 1995, during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there is going to be a genocide at Srebrenica where 7,000 Muslim men and boys, as well as all of the Dutch UN peacekeepers guarding the town, are going to lose their lives. And all of a sudden, the world's appetite for peacekeeping is really going to diminish. And countries that used to provide troops, places like Canada and Norway and New Zealand, which used to use this as a way of trying to have a bigger voice in global politics, are going to be a lot more recalcitrant and a lot less willing to do this. What we're going to talk about going forward is the way that two developments, one, peace enforcement, and two, the responsibility to protect, are going to continue to change the nature of what keeping the peace means, and are going to keep on changing the UN's role going forward in different conflicts and different conflict zones. And this is some of the material we're going to be focusing on next.